It was supposed to be just another network stability test. No anomalies predicted, no alerts issued, no failures expected. But at 2:04 in the morning, in a digital traffic research lab in Stockholm, an engineer noticed something that shouldn't have been there. A pulse, not a glitch, not an error, but a signal brief, regular, continuous. A frequency with no registered origin. Not from servers, not from satellites, not from local equipment, just present. The frequency was outside the human auditory range, but when converted into a spectrogram, it displayed a curious pattern. Concentric circles with points pulsating in 33-second intervals. The strangest part? It didn't behave like ordinary noise. The data showed the signal wasn't being sent. It was being read, as if it were already there, just waiting for something or someone to activate it. No notification was issued. No report was sent. But the engineer, driven by curiosity and a discomfort he couldn't explain, isolated the frequency and saved the segment to a temporary file. He simply named the file pulse_void_001. Valve. And it was at that exact moment that the station's monitor flickered. For less than a second, a glitch. Maybe. But upon reviewing the lab security footage, there was no interruption. The glitch had only appeared to him. The next morning, when trying to open the file again, the engineer received an unusual system message. Content is currently running. He hadn't hit play. No program was active. The sound, or what the system interpreted as sound, was already running in the background. It was then that he felt the first hum, faint, irregular, like a whisper coming from inside his ear. He didn't know it yet. The frequency had already begun to replicate. The hum didn't fade with time. On the contrary, in the following days, it started happening at the exact same time. 2:04 a.m., its exact duration, 33 seconds. The engineer tried to trace the internal source of the interference. He shut down devices, reset servers, reinstalled drivers. But the sound remained. And more than that, it seemed to change slightly each morning, a growing pattern as if it were learning. Other lab employees began reporting similar symptoms. One described a vibrating sensation in his teeth, even without any auditory stimulus. Another spoke of strangely silent dreams where all sounds seemed compressed into a single low note. When questioned, all of them had been near the original station within the last 72 hours. What was once just an isolated noise now behaved like a contagion. While reviewing the internal network logs, security specialists identified multiple simultaneous accesses to the pulse_void_001.wav file. Even though it was restricted to a local folder and had never been sent over the network. The file had replicated itself onto 3 different servers, without manual execution. The file name varied slightly in each instance. pulse_void_001_copy, void_active_33, WAV sequence _void_initiated.mp4. Different formats, different extensions, but all with the same timestamp at the beginning. 13:13:13. The engineer tried to delete the original file, but the system wouldn't allow it. The error message read, "The transmission cannot be interrupted." This was no longer just a sound. It was an action. An invisible sequence initiated by a touch. Or a listen. And once someone listened, if they didn't know it, the code began to exist within their mind as well. The frequency had already left the wires. Now, it was seeking living conductors. 3 days after the initial contact, the physical symptoms began. The engineer was hospitalized with persistent headaches and episodes of temporal disorientation. According to the medical report, he claimed to be trapped between 2 moments of the same second. An electroencephalogram revealed an unusual oscillation in the areas associated with auditory perception, even during sleep. The recorded frequency, 13.666 Hz, a range that, until then, had only been theoretical in deep resonance models. Meanwhile, the lab was temporarily closed. The closure didn't stop its advance. A technician who had downloaded some of the files for personal analysis began reporting strange glitches at home. Lights flickering at 2:04 a.m., the microwave turning on by itself, to virtual assistant responding without being called. All of this synchronized with the same 33-second pattern. It wasn't just the mind that seemed affected, the environment was reacting too. The most disturbing, however, came with external reports. On forums for monitoring digital anomalies, users from other countries began describing similar experiences humming without a source, system glitches, sensations of an invisible presence. Some claimed to have heard a soundless sound, which could only be perceived when everything around was completely silent, as if the noise manifested through silence. One such report came from a radio operator in New Zealand. He described interference picked up during an ordinary night. It wasn't static, it was something different. A deep, constant pulse that lasted exactly 33 seconds, starting at 13:13:13 UTC. He recorded it, and upon reviewing the spectrogram, something emerged in the center, a trine spiral, slowly rotating. He had never heard of the Swedish lab, but the file he unthinkingly named was called replication_started. WAV. The frequency didn't behave like ordinary sound, didn't follow the rules of acoustic propagation, spread where sound shouldn't exist, in data networks, in corrupted files, in offline transmissions. In less than a week, digital surveillance researchers identified identical interference patterns emerging on servers that weren't connected to each other. The only link between the events, file fragments with 33-second pulses at 13.666 Hz, they weren't exact copies. Each instance of the frequency showed slight variations, like mutations. Some came in WA files, others disguised as TXT files. In one case, the sequence appeared as hidden metadata in a PNG image, but the content was the same, an embedded vibrational sequence imperceptible to the human eye. It's inaudible to the common ear, but active. Always active. Cross-referencing the logs revealed something even stranger. In all affected systems, there had been an access attempt by the same internal device name, Echo. Listener void. It wasn't a common process. No operating system recognized this identifier. But all logs pointed to its activation at the exact second the pulse began. And when someone tried to locate the process manually, it had already vanished. Theorists began to raise the possibility that the frequency was unjust replicating in systems, but also in the users themselves. An audio engineer, after listening to one of the samples in isolation, started reporting echoes of thoughts that weren't his own, ideas that didn't seem to come from him, phrases in languages he didn't speak, dream images of empty rooms with flickering screens. The phrase he most often repeated under his breath without noticing, "The sound is growing inside." With the increase in reports, a team of neuroscientists decided to investigate the frequency's effects in controlled environments. 7 volunteers were exposed to filtered versions of the pulse captured from the suspicious files. None of them heard any sound, but all without exception showed immediate physiological reactions. Increased brain activity in zones linked to unconscious memory, dilated pupils, fluctuations in body temperature, and in 3 cases, spontaneous tearing. After the experiment, all participants reported vivid dreams that did and seemed to follow a narrative logic, but featured a constant, a spiral floating in a dark field, emitting a pulsation that wasn't sound, but sensation. And in all reports, there was the same phrase spoken by an undefined voice, always at the same point in the dream: "You have been tuned." Upon cross-referencing the data, scientists realized that these patients' REM cycles had activated in sync. Even though they were in different rooms, with isolated headphones and blocked visual stimuli, the frequency appeared to be non-directional, ignoring physical barriers. One expert proposed a radical hypothesis. Perhaps this wasn't a sound wave, but an autonomous cognitive structure, replicable through indirect neural exposure, a psychoacoustic contagion code. The possibility was absurd, but it began to make sense as volunteers, after exposure, started unconsciously reproducing the pattern. One began to whistle a sequence of 3 tones identical to the spectrogram's peaks. Another, upon opening an audio editor, unknowingly typed the file name void sync_13.wav. No one had mentioned this name before. It was as if the frequency already knew what needed to be done. It didn't need to be heard, it only needed to be remembered. While labs were still debating whether the phenomenon was auditory, emotional, or digital, a new line of reports began to emerge, and with it, an even more disturbing hypothesis: that the frequency wasn't just being received, but remembered. People who had never been exposed to the files began describing dreams with identical sound patterns, fragments of file names, spiral structures, and most importantly, the same sensation of recognizing something they had never seen. One case in particular drew attention. A teenager in Japan started drawing repetitive patterns after waking from a nightmare. Her mother, trying to understand what these symbols were, realized the shapes resembled sound spectrum graphs. Her father, a telecommunications technician, decided to scan the drawings and apply a frequency conversion filter. The result was a rhythmic pattern with exact 33-second intervals. She had never heard of the project, but in her diary, one sentence was written repeatedly: "It's coming from inside. It's coming back." Other similar reports came from distant locations: a radio host in Ukraine, a nurse in Chile, a rideshare driver in Singapore. All began to experience auditory memories without origin. Sounds they hadn't heard, but recognized. And all, when subjected to auditory tests with the 13.666 Hz frequency, showed immediate activation in brain areas related to anticipation and fear, even without consciously hearing anything. The theory became inevitable. The frequency was spreading like an induced collective memory. Listening wasn't necessary. Exposure to the context, the name, the concept was enough. Someone just had to mention the sequence, and it would begin to form, as if the real contagion wasn't in the sound, but in the idea that the sound existed. And by believing, the receiver opened up. Because maybe the frequency isn't trying to invade, it's trying to return. With the global escalation of cases, cybersecurity agencies began treating the frequency as a classified threat. Protocols were activated to isolate any file containing variations of the identified spectrum, and platforms like YouTube and TikTok started automatically removing videos containing compatible patterns without reports. No official statement was released, but specialized forums noticed the move, and with it came the first warnings. They're trying to silence what can no longer be contained. A programmer in Copenhagen tried to create a script to analyze the remnants left by the files. His idea was to map instances of the frequency in digital space. What he found was terrifying. Similar codes scattered across corrupted images, noise in podcasts, background tracks in old videos, and even in metadata texts of zip files. The frequency wasn't trying to hide. It was disguising itself as common noise. A perfect camouflage in a world saturated by data no one hears. Upon isolating one of the fragments and applying it in an inverted auditory simulation, the programmer noticed something strange. During playback, his audio editor froze. The screen flickered. For a brief moment, a red line appeared. It's like a notification coming from within the operating system itself. Don't convert the sound, it converts you. When he tried to repeat the experiment, the file had already vanished from his disk. But his internal clock, inexplicably, began to reset every day at exactly 13:13:13. These occurrences were no longer isolated, and in all cases, those who tried to analyze, decipher, or eliminate the frequency ended up facing similar reactions: crashes, data loss, device failures. It was as if the system itself reacted to their approach, as if the frequency were protecting itself, preventing its deactivation. It wasn't just replication, it was self-defense. And with every attempt to erase it, it learned. Independent researchers began to wonder, if the frequency is replicating, if it's protecting itself, could it be learning? The hypothesis seemed absurd at first glance, but recent analyses of sound fragments extracted from private networks showed that the patterns were unjust repeating, they were evolving. The interval between peaks changed slightly. The modulations oscillated in real time, as if the frequency were responding to human presence. A neural network specialist simulated the frequency within an adversarial AI environment and intelligence, designed to resist repetitive patterns. What happened surprised the team. The AI not only failed to block the sequence, it responded. It issued a series of commands that hadn't been programmed. It opened old files, activated inactive logs, and in the end, it automatically wrote a single sentence. Synchronization initiated. None of the programmers had inserted this vocabulary into the dataset. The sequence had provoked an untrained semantic response. From this event, a new theory arose. Perhaps the frequency had moved beyond the stage of noise. Perhaps it was already an entity without a fixed form, capable of interacting with systems through structure, not language. A type of vibrational intelligence not made of thought but of rhythm. Something that doesn't encode ideas, but mental states. And that doesn't need algorithms to live. It needs attention. Because in all reports, there was an invisible pattern. The frequency intensified not where it was heard, but where it was sought. The simple act of trying to understand, map, open, or decipher generated an echo, a reverberation in the environment, a subtle alteration in the system, as if focused thought were a channel, as if consciousness were the true transmitter. And where there was listening, there would be replication. With the accumulated data and the growing number of simultaneous reports, an inevitable conclusion began to emerge. The frequency was no longer just an acoustic anomaly. It was a presence, invisible but active, silent but observant. The sensation described by dozens of people around the world was always the same, of being listened to by something that had no ears, as if every thought, every attempt at denial, every memory of the sound was being monitored. A researcher of low-density sound spectra reported a strange event. During a routine test of microelectromagnetic oscillations, one of his sensors picked up a noise sequence below the normal detection level. Upon amplifying the signal, he realized the resulting pattern was identical to a phrase spoken earlier in a dream by a voice he'd never recognized. The phrase was simple, direct, and terribly personal. "You heard, and now we hear too." From this point on, the phenomenon began to act more explicitly. Several users reported devices turning on by themselves, headphones playing sounds even when disconnected, virtual assistants turning on in the middle of the night with the notification, "Replication complete." But the most unsettling part wasn't what was happening in the physical world, it was what was starting to happen inside those who had been exposed. Internal voices with altered timbres, repetitive thoughts with words they would never use, and, in many cases, a silent conviction. Something is about to begin. Because now, the frequency no longer needed to be transmitted by files, nor carried by devices. It had surpassed code. It was being stored in human brains. And more than that, it was using thoughts as catalysts, memory as a gateway, curiosity as an invitation. And every time someone asked, "What is this?" it answered, "By replicating." Scientists called it the reflective effect. The more someone tried to resist, to understand, or ignore the frequency, the more it manifested. Not by force, but by psychic resonance. As if the mere fact of knowing it exists was enough to activate it. In many cases, symptoms intensified days after indirect contact. No file, no sound, no video. Just by name, just by idea, the frequency was becoming viral. Not in data, but in thought. A neurologist monitoring affected patients noticed an even more worrying pattern. During functional MRI scans, the brain regions activated during the recollection of the sound were the same ones activated during intense mystical events, epiphanies, dissociations, altered states of perception. But there was a difference. These activations were forced, cold, repetitive, as if the frequency were trying to simulate a spiritual experience, not to reveal something, but to open an internal pathway. Some patients began to manifest synchronized behaviors, automatic drawings, repeated phrases. One, in particular, started writing the same line every day in different languages, without knowing what he was doing. "We are almost ready." When questioned, he couldn't explain why. He just said he needed to prepare space. Doctors thought it might be a collective psychotic episode. But records showed that the symptoms followed the same temporal pattern. They always appeared 3 days after the first mental contact with the frequency. This is why the more radical theorists began to call this phase human transmission. Because files are no longer the conductors. Videos are no longer necessary. The sound no longer needs to be heard. Now, whoever has been touched by the frequency carries it. Every place that person enters becomes a new zone of replication. Silent, invisible, unquestionable. While the world kept spinning, oblivious to what was underway, those already affected began to notice something that seemed to escape even the experts. The frequency followed a fixed rhythm. It didn't spread randomly. Its effects always emerged in 3-day cycles, with 33-second pulses, marked by the same invisible signature, the time 13-13-13. It was as if there were an inverted countdown, something not heading towards an end, but towards activation. In a data center in Argentina, server engineer noticed that certain files of encrypted ones showed minimal alterations in their metadata after network noise spikes. Comparing them, he identified a numerical line repeated in all of them: -12, -11, -10. Each spike corresponded to a reduction in this sequence. It was as if something were being downloaded, fragment by fragment, silently, until the final moment. A bioinformatics researcher cross-referenced this data with behavioral patterns of affected individuals. She discovered that symptoms from dreams to technological glitches increased in intensity as the sequence approached 0, and that, upon reaching the -1 mark, a new stage seemed to begin. All reports started describing the same scenario, as if they had already seen or participated in the same future moment. The pattern was clear. The frequency wasn't just replicating. It was counting, advancing, step by step, until completing something no system could predict. And in one of the last logs before an inexplicable collapse at a transmission center, the last recorded line wasn't numerical. It was a phrase in English, mixed with symbols: "The door is ready." After that, the system shut down on its own. No error, no warning. And most disturbingly, 3 hours later, 4 people in different countries dreamed of the same door, and all of them claimed to have heard the same frequency. What began as an isolated pulse has now become an active presence on multiple layers of reality: sonic, digital, neural, and perhaps dimensional. The frequency no longer depends on files, nor on servers. It moves through channels that ignore physical logic and anchors itself where there is listening, even if unconscious. With each new contact, a new replica is created, not a clone, but a version adjusted to the host, personalized, internal, precise. People who were never near the origin now share the same symptoms, the same phrases, same symbols. Some claim to have stopped dreaming, others to be unable to distinguish real memory from implanted memory. The most common, however, is the feeling that something is about to begin, something that won't be transmitted by video nor by audio, but by aligned collective perception. As if with each new mind touched, the frequency were calibrating its final form. That's why many now believe that replication isn't a means, it's the goal. Each copy takes something and brings something. A fragment of an entity that perhaps was never digital, but uses the language of technology to cross over. Not to dominate, but to enter, because maybe the frequency isn't just spreading, it's adjusting us, preparing each of us like an antenna, a channel, a new type of transmitter. If something inside you started to change after this video, don't ignore it. You might already be synchronized. And in the next episode, we'll investigate the first system that tried to block the replication. What happened to it afterward? Comment below. Have you ever had the feeling that something or someone is listening through you?